The British Empire was the largest empire in history. It ruled over a quarter of the world's land. It governed nearly a quarter of the world's people. This did not happen by accident. It was not built on peaceful trade alone. The story of the British Empire is a story of war. War was the engine that drove its expansion. It was the tool used to seize territory. It was the force that crushed resistance. From the windswept coasts of North America to the sweltering plains of India, British soldiers and sailors fought to build this global superpower. Understanding these wars is key to understanding the empire itself. They reveal the ambition, the violence, and the human cost behind its creation. We often think of the empire in terms of trade and administration. We picture merchants with their goods and governors in their grand houses, but behind every trading post was a fort. Behind every governor was an army. The British did not simply walk into new lands and declare them their own. They fought for them. They battled rival European powers like France, Spain, the Netherlands. They waged countless wars against local rulers and indigenous peoples who dared to stand in their way. These conflicts, big and small, are the building blocks of the British Empire. Each victory added another piece to the vast imperial puzzle, shaping the world we live in today. History is often written by the victors. The story of the British Empire is no exception. For many years, the popular narrative was one of progress, civilization. It was a story of bringing order, technology, enlightenment. But this sanitized version leaves out a crucial element: violence. The empire was not given, it was taken. It was built on the battlefield, conquest, and at this point of a gun. Not just British ingenuity, commerce, but also British blood, steel. To ignore this is to ignore how empires are made. Imperial expansion was relentless and often brutal. It began with small steps. English adventurers raided Spanish treasure fleets. They established precarious colonies in Ireland, North America. These early conflicts set a pattern. Military force overcame rivals and subdued local populations. As Britain's ambitions grew, so did the scale of its wars. Minor clashes evolved into global conflicts. How did a small, damp island on the edge of Europe become a global superpower? The story of the British Empire is one of ambition and commerce, but at its core, the answer lies in its ability to project power and wage war successfully. The answer lies in its ability to wage war successfully. In the 16th century, England was a second-rate power. It looked nervously at the mighty empires of Spain and Portugal, whose galleons were laden with the silver of the Americas and the spices of the East. But it had advantages. As an island, it was difficult to invade. This security allowed it to focus its resources outwards. It developed a strong maritime tradition built on fishing, trade, and piracy. This culture bred tough, experienced sailors. This tradition would give birth to the Royal Navy, the institution that would become the backbone of the British Empire. English monarchs like Elizabeth I sponsored privateers, legalized pirates to wage a proxy war. Chief among these sea dogs was Sir Francis Drake, to the English a hero, to the Spanish the pirate El Drake. They were encouraged to attack the treasure fleets of the Spanish Empire. Drake's raids were incredibly profitable. They filled the Queen's treasury, destabilized the Spanish economy, and boosted the nation's confidence. The famous defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 was a turning point. In a running battle up the Channel, smaller, more nimble English ships harried the Spanish galleons. Fire ships and a fierce storm, hailed as a Protestant wind, shattered the invincible fleet. It was a huge psychological victory. It showed that the mighty Spanish Empire was not invincible. It announced England's arrival as a serious naval power. This victory protected England from invasion and opened the door for its own overseas ambitions, setting the stage for future colonization. They looked first to their closest neighbour, Ireland. Fearing Catholic Ireland could be used as a backdoor for its enemies, the conquest of Ireland became a priority. It was a long and brutal process. It served as a laboratory for empire. The methods used there, the plantation of settlers, the harsh suppression of rebellion, the seizure of land, would be repeated across the globe. The largest of these was the plantation of Ulster in the early 17th century. The aim was to create a loyal Protestant population that would secure the region for the crown, creating deep-seated conflicts that would last for centuries. the plantation system was a brutal but effective model for how to build an empire. First conquer the land, then remove the native population and replace them with loyal settlers. Ireland, therefore, became a laboratory for the British Empire. It was where the English learned the business of colonization. The brutal blueprint for building a settler empire was really first drawn in the green fields of Ireland. In 1607, the Virginia Company of London, a private enterprise with a royal charter, established a settlement at Jamestown. Their goal was profit, to find gold and exploit the resources of a new land. This was not a military invasion in the traditional sense, but from the very beginning their survival depended on war. They faced the powerful Powhatan Confederacy. As the English demanded more land, cautious trade turned to conflict. A series of brutal Anglo-Powhatan wars erupted. Further north, another group of English settlers arrived. Pilgrims landed at Plymouth in 1620, followed by the much larger Puritan migration to Massachusetts Bay, both seeking religious freedom. But their expanding settlements and alien concepts of land ownership inevitably led to conflict. Tensions grew until they exploded into open warfare. King Philip's War in the 1670s was a devastating conflict, led by the Wampanoag Sachem Metacomet. It was a desperate struggle for survival against colonial expansion. These early colonial wars established a pattern for English and later British expansion in North America. War was the cutting edge of settlement. It cleared the land, broke the power of the indigenous peoples, and planted the British flag ever deeper into the American continent. For much of the 17th century, the Dutch were masters of global trade. As England built its own overseas presence, it came into conflict with this powerhouse, the Dutch Republic. To challenge them, Parliament under Oliver Cromwell passed the Navigation Acts. These laws were economic warfare, stipulating that goods imported to England or its colonies must be on English ships. This was a direct attack on the Dutch, who acted as middlemen for Europe's trade and was designed to build up England's merchant marine at their expense. The result was a series of 3 Anglo-Dutch wars. These wars were fought almost entirely at sea. A key moment came in 1664. An English fleet captured the poorly defended Dutch capital of New Amsterdam without a fight. Renamed New York, this strategic victory was crucial. It consolidated England's control over the North American seaboard, linking their New England colonies with those in the south. The Dutch Golden Age was over, and Britain was on its way to becoming the world's dominant commercial and naval power. The West Indies became the crown jewels of Britain's early empire, far more valuable than North America. The reason was sugar. The sugar revolution turned this rare luxury into a mass-market staple. This demand created a monstrous system. To work the plantations, millions of enslaved Africans were transported across the Atlantic in the horrific Middle Passage. This was the infamous triangular trade: goods to Africa, enslaved people to the Americas, and the sugar they produced back to Europe, generating immense profits at an incalculable human cost. The incredible wealth generated by sugar made the Caribbean islands prizes worth fighting for. The region became a constant battleground. These wars in the Caribbean were driven by the Royal Navy. Success in the Caribbean depended almost entirely on naval supremacy. The military was therefore used for 2 purposes in the Caribbean: fighting external wars against European rivals and waging an internal war to maintain the brutal system of slavery that generated the empire's wealth. In the East, a different project was taking shape. In 1600, merchants received a royal charter creating the East India Company. Their ships sailed to India seeking spices and textiles. They established small trading posts at ports like Surat and Madras, but they were guests in a huge land, operating at the mercy of powerful Mughal emperors. They were there to trade, not to rule, but India was changing. By the early 18th century, the great Mughal Empire was in terminal decline. Power devolved to regional warlords, and the political situation became a chaotic patchwork of competing states, creating both danger and opportunity for the company. The East India Company found itself caught in the middle of these conflicts. To protect their investments, they needed soldiers. The company began to intervene in local politics. The East India Company had discovered a new business model, the business of war. The man who best exploited this new game of power was Robert Clive. Arriving in India as a company clerk, he found office life tedious and sought a military commission. He quickly proved a natural soldier and a master of political maneuvering. He was ambitious, daring, and utterly ruthless. The perfect man for an era where the lines between trade and war were blurring. The catalyst for conquest came in 1756. The Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dowlah, captured the company's settlement at Calcutta. According to a British survivor's account, many captives were imprisoned overnight in a tiny guardroom, with most dying. This became known as the Black Hole of Calcutta. While historians debate the details, suggesting exaggeration for propaganda, the effect was electrifying. The story caused outrage in Britain, providing the company with the perfect moral justification for a war of retribution, a war that was really about control and profit. The two armies met at a place called Plassey. On paper, Clive stood no chance, but he had a secret weapon: betrayal. The Battle of Plassey was less a battle and more a coup. Clive had made a secret pact with Mir Jafar, one of the Nawab's commanders, to betray his master in exchange for the throne. When a downpour soaked the Nawab's gunpowder, Clive advanced and Mir Jafar's troops stood aside. The Nawab's army disintegrated. Clive, true to his word, placed the traitor on the throne of Bengal. With this single victory, the East India Company went from traders to effective rulers of India's wealthiest province, and the path to an Indian empire was now wide open. While the East India Company was fighting for control of India, a much larger conflict was erupting across the globe. The 7 Years' War has been called the First True World War. It was a global struggle for supremacy. Britain, France, the British government, led by William Pitt the Elder, would focus their main effort on destroying the French overseas empire. Britain's key advantage in this global war was the Royal Navy. Pitt used the Navy to blockade French ports, preventing them from sending reinforcements and supplies to their colonies. The most important theatre of the 7 Years' War was North America. The conflict was over the future of the entire continent. A young British general, James Wolfe, was given command. Finally, he devised a daring, high-risk plan. The battle was short and decisive. British infantry held their fire until the French were close, then unleashed a devastating volley. Both Wolfe and Montcalm were killed in the fighting. The fall of Quebec began the end for the French in North America. The war had secured the continent for the British Empire, but victory came with a hidden and dangerous price. The war had been incredibly expensive. Parliament decided to impose direct taxes on the colonies. These taxes were met with furious opposition in America. Their slogan became "No taxation without representation." The final straw came with the Tea Act and the Boston Tea Party in 1773. In 1775, fighting broke out at Lexington and Concord. The American War of Independence had begun. Britain's greatest victory had, in a tragic irony, sown the seeds of its greatest imperial defeat. A new, even greater threat was about to emerge. A brilliant and ambitious general named Napoleon Bonaparte seized power. For more than 2 decades, Britain was locked in a bitter and relentless struggle. This was a war for national survival. The war became a contest between the French elephant, invincible on land, and the British whale, unstoppable at sea. Finally, on October 21, 1805, he cornered them off Cape Trafalgar, Spain. Trafalgar was a stunning, total British victory. The victory came at terrible cost. At the height of battle, Nelson was shot by a French sniper. The final, decisive confrontation took place on June 18, 1815, near a small village in Belgium called Waterloo. The victory at Waterloo ushered in a century of British dominance. As the 19th century unfolded, the British Empire, at its zenith, grew increasingly paranoid about its most prized possession, India, the jewel in the crown. To the north, the Russian Empire was relentlessly expanding southwards. In the vast remote deserts and mountains of Central Asia, where these two giants met, a new kind of conflict began. It was a long, clandestine struggle of espionage and influence, fought not on traditional battlefields but in the shadows. It became known as the Great Game. The players in this game were a unique breed of men: soldiers in disguise, surveyors mapping forbidden territory under the guise of religious pilgrimage, and political agents sent to bribe or intimidate local khans and emirs. Every map, every piece of intelligence was a move on a geopolitical chessboard, with India as the ultimate prize. The game turned deadly when Britain decided to force its hand in Afghanistan. the rugged buffer state they believed was key to India's defense. Fearing a pro-Russian ruler in Kabul, the British invaded in 1839 to install their own puppet king, Shah Shuja. The initial invasion was deceptively easy, but the occupation provoked a furious national uprising. In the brutal winter of 1842, the British were forced into a disastrous retreat from Kabul. The entire column of 16,000 soldiers, staff, and their families was annihilated by Afghan tribesmen and the freezing cold. Only one British man, Assistant Surgeon William Bryden, staggered to the fort at Jalalabad, a ghost-like figure on a dying horse, the sole European survivor to tell the tale of an imperial catastrophe. Further east, Britain faced a different kind of problem with China's Qing dynasty. A massive trade imbalance saw British silver flowing into China in exchange for tea and silk, but the Chinese had little interest in British goods. The East India Company found a cynical solution: opium grown in British India. The trade created millions of addicts in China and reversed the flow of silver. In 1839, the determined Imperial Commissioner Lin Zexu was sent to Canton with a mandate to eradicate the trade. He seized and destroyed over 20,000 chests of British opium, a quantity valued at millions of pounds. Britain responded with force. The First Opium War was brutally one-sided. Britain's new steam-powered gunboats, like the iron-hulled Nemesis, sailed up Chinese rivers, their cannons systematically destroying antiquated forts and wooden junks. The war showcased the terrifying technological gap that had opened between the industrializing West and the rest of the world. China was forced to sign the humiliating Treaty of Nanking, ceding Hong Kong to Britain and opening its ports to foreign trade, the first of the unequal treaties that would cripple its sovereignty. By the late 19th century, this technological superiority fueled an even greater imperial ambition. In a sudden burst of competitive frenzy known as the Scramble for Africa, the powers of Europe raced to conquer and divide the continent. At the Berlin Conference of 1884, they drew lines on maps, creating colonies with no regard for existing cultures or ethnic groups, formalizing a new age of exploitation. Britain's drive to control the Nile River led them into conflict with the Mahdi state in Sudan, a fierce Islamic resistance movement. The campaign culminated in the Battle of Omdurman in 1898. It was less a battle than a massacre. An Anglo-Egyptian army of 25,000 men, armed with modern rifles and Maxim machine guns, faced 50,000 Mahdist warriors. In a few hours, over 10,000 Mahdists were killed for the loss of just 47 of their opponents. It was a terrifying example of the power of modern military technology against traditional armies. But even at its peak, the foundations of the empire were fragile. In India, decades of resentment were simmering just below the surface. The British had annexed native states, disregarded local customs, and allowed Christian missionaries to operate with an unsettling zeal. The spark that ignited this powder keg came in 1857. It was a new rifle cartridge, rumoured to be greased with a mixture of pig and cow fat. Anathema to both Muslim and Hindu soldiers, the sepoys. They believed it was a deliberate plot to defile their faith and force their conversion to Christianity. In May 1857, at the military cantonment of Meerut, 85 sepoys refused the new cartridges. They were publicly humiliated, stripped of their uniforms and sentenced to 10 years of hard labour. The next day, their enraged comrades rose in a furious rebellion, shooting their British officers and marching on the ancient capital of Delhi. This was not just a soldiers' mutiny. It exploded into a widespread popular uprising across northern India. Dispossessed princes, landlords who had lost their estates, and peasants crushed by debt all joined the fight, united by a common desire to drive the British out. The rebellion was marked by terrible atrocities on both sides, but the British response was systematic and merciless. The war to retake northern India became a war of terror. British punitive columns swept through the countryside, burning villages and carrying out mass hangings. Captured rebels were subjected to a horrifying new form of execution, being strapped to the mouth of a cannon and blown apart. They unleashed what many Indians would come to call the Devil's Wind. After the rebellion was finally crushed, the British Empire underwent a fundamental change. The East India Company, the private corporation that had conquered a subcontinent, was abolished. In 1858, the British government took direct control of India, beginning the period of formal imperial rule known as the British Raj. Yet, even as the empire consolidated its power, it continued to face fierce resistance. In southern Africa, British expansionist ambitions collided with a formidable, highly disciplined military power, the Zulu Kingdom. In 1879, under the pretext of a minor border dispute, the British issued an impossible ultimatum to the Zulu king Cetshwayo and invaded his lands. The British, supremely confident in their technology, fatally underestimated their opponent. On January 22, 1879, at the foot of a hill called Isandlwana, a massive Zulu impi of 20,000 warriors, using their classic horns of the buffalo formation, descended on an unfortified British camp. The Zulus overwhelmed the British lines in a brutal close-quarter struggle. It was one of the most catastrophic defeats ever suffered by a modern professional army against a traditional indigenous force. On the very same day, news of a very different battle reached the world. At a small mission station called Rorke's Drift, a garrison of just over 150 British and colonial soldiers successfully defended their post for 12 hours against an attack by 4,000 Zulu warriors. The heroic defense was seized upon by the press back home, a tale of valor to mask the humiliation of Isandlwana, and resulted in the award of 11 Victoria Crosses. The Empire's troubles in South Africa were far from over. Here they faced not an indigenous kingdom but the Boers, descendants of early Dutch settlers, also known as Afrikaners. These fiercely independent farmers and devout Calvinists had trekked inland to escape British rule and establish their own republics. When Britain annexed their Transvaal Republic in 1877, the Boers rose up. The First Boer War of 1880–81 was a short and humiliating disaster for the British, culminating in a defeat at Majuba Hill, where Boer marksmen picked off British soldiers with ease. Peace was short-lived. The discovery of the world's largest deposits of gold in the Transvaal in 1886 changed everything. Britain and the powerful capitalists in its orbit were determined to control this wealth. The Second Boer War broke out in 1899. After initial Boer successes, the might of the empire was brought to bear. But the Boers refused to surrender, melting into the countryside to wage a brilliant and protracted guerrilla war. To combat these elusive commandos, the British commander, Lord Kitchener, implemented a brutal counterinsurgency strategy. His forces systematically burned Boer farms and implemented a scorched earth policy. To deny the guerrillas food and shelter, they rounded up tens of thousands of Boer women and children and herded them into what became known as concentration camps. Conditions in these camps were appalling. Malnutrition and disease were rampant. Over 26,000 women and children died, a tragedy exposed to a horrified British public by activists like Emily Hobhouse. The war had revealed a dark, ruthless side to the imperial project. By 1902, the Boers were finally forced to surrender. The British had won, but at a terrible cost to their reputation, their resources, and their sense of moral certainty. The cracks in the imperial facade were beginning to show. In August 1914, a new kind of war began. When Britain declared war on Germany, the entire British Empire was automatically at war too. Millions of men from every corner of the globe volunteered to fight for the king and the empire. The contribution of the empire's soldiers was immense. The war was fought across the globe in many of the empire's territories. The human cost was honestly catastrophic. Nearly 1 million men from across the British Empire were dead. The financial cost was equally devastating. Britain simply no longer had the overwhelming economic power that had allowed it to build and police its vast global empire. The war shattered the myth of European superiority. The war had lit a fire of nationalism that would prove impossible to extinguish. Just 2 decades after the end of the war, to end all wars, the world was plunged into conflict once again. For the British Empire, it would be both its finest hour and its final act. The supposedly impregnable fortress of Singapore fell in February 1942, an event Churchill called the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. Once again, the empire's contribution was vital. Without the manpower and resources of the empire, Britain simply could not have continued the fight, let alone emerged victorious. The first and most significant loss was India, the jewel in the crown. The lowering of the Union Jack signaled the age of empire was over. A wave of decolonization swept Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean. But elsewhere, the end of empire was violent. The story of the British Empire is inseparable from the story of war. Military force was the primary instrument of imperial expansion. The world map itself, with national borders often drawn along colonial lines, is a direct legacy of these conflicts. The global dominance of the English language, the creation of a multicultural commonwealth. In Britain itself, the legacy is complex. It is a story written in blood and steel of ambition, power, resistance, and change. By examining the wars that made and unmade the empire, we gain a clearer understanding of the forces that have shaped our present, reminding us that the past is never truly past.